Lately, there have been several rumors about my being gay, and I'd like to take those gay rumors to bed. To understand, we need to go back to the beginning of last week. To clarify, not the beginning of time. Look, at the beginning of last week, it was a Monday, like it often is at the beginning of the week, and my mother was placing bread, fruits, and other supplies into my little basket, ready for my trek through the forest to deliver it to my grandmother. You need to understand, my grandmother lives at the fringes of society, and at her age, it gets a little hard for her to make the long trek to the market. Therefore, lately, my mother has requested that I visit her regularly with supplies. I pulled my beautiful scarlet velvet cape, accompanied with a hood, which was itself a present from my grandmother, and began skipping gaily through the forest. Now, here when I say gaily, I mean happily, rather than cavorting around in a homosexual manner, as I understand gay people are often wont to do. As I pranced merrily through the forest, I happened upon a very large dog. Now, my first immediate thought was to simply daintily frolic on my merry way, perhaps while humming a gay tune to myself. Again, when I say gay, I mean in the sense of happy, rather than in the sense of desiring to have carnal relations with another man. Now, this dog said, "Good day" to me, which would understandably stop my joyous twerking in mid-flow, because in my experience, dogs don't often talk. I didn't want to be impolite, however, and wish the dog a good day in return. The body language of the dog told me that he, and I assume, judging by the deep voice the creature had, was in fact a he, was eager to continue conversation. However, I decided to cut this off before it could begin, informing the dog that I was going to visit my grandmother and deliver her a basket of goods, as she was so frail out there, alone in her cottage with no one around to help for miles. The dog expressed sympathy, asking where this cottage could be found and whether my grandmother had implemented any security measures to avoid the unwanted attentions of the brigands and blackguards who roam these woods. I gave detailed directions, as I was certain meeting a talking dog would be something of a novelty for her. The dog went on his way, disappearing into the woods, and I continued my passionate gay cavorting along the path to my grandmother's house. Once again, I use the term gay to mean happy. The pleasant birdsong made me feel cheerful, and I began humming some soothing tunes as I continued my deeply gay gamboling. For the last time, I assure you, I mean gay in the sense of happy. I'm not going to tell you again, okay? Please understand. Eventually, I arrived at my grandmother's cottage and used my key to let myself inside, calling out to my grandmother to let her know I was there. She called back to me, letting me know she was in her bedroom resting. This didn't surprise me. Many of you with elderly relatives will understand there are good days and bad days, and I naturally assumed this was a bad day for her. Her voice was unusually rough, as though she had a cold. When I walked into the room, I saw that it was indeed a bad day for her. I noted a number of ailments afflicting my grandmother. For one, she appeared to be suffering a severe case of hirsutism. For another, her ears and nose had grown not unusual in the elderly, as both noses and ears get larger as we get older. Though that's not due to growing, as is commonly believed, but rather what we see is the effect of skin changes in gravity. My grandmother likes me to comment when I see a notable change in her physical condition. I think she's a bit of a hypochondriac, but I indulge her irregardless, which is a real word. Feel free to fact check me, in part because I think it's useful for her to know when what she perceives about herself is accurate. What big arms you have, Grandma, I gaily observed, noting that her arms are both muscular and covered in dense black hair. The better to embrace you, my dear, my grandmother replies, displaying that sage wisdom for which I regard her so highly. What big legs you have, Grandma, I note, deciding that I may as well finish my appraisal of her limbs now that I've started. The better to run, my dear, my grandmother replies, with the brilliance of so much experience compressed into a form which had once been small, but had now apparently grown rapidly to contain all the aforementioned experience. What big ears you have, Grandma, I comment, observing that her ears appear significantly larger than I remember, on top of being on the top of her head and sort of triangular. All the better to hear you with, my dear, my grandmother replies, which I personally think is a more than reasonable point. You often hear of people getting body modifications, and the elderly are often sadly at risk of losing their hearing or other senses. So this adjustment made sense, and I decided to move on to my next observation. What big eyes you have, Grandma. This is my next observation, in large part because I felt my previous notation attained the kind of encouraging reply every grandson hopes to hear from their grandmother. All the better to see you with, my dear. The tone in her voice suggests that she is perhaps tiring of our admittedly somewhat repetitive conversation. I decide to make one more observation before handing over the basket. My next observation needs to be pertinent, and I realize the best way to do this is tying it to the supplies I brought my grandmother. What big teeth you have, Grandma, I observe, with a wisdom which effortlessly surpasses Socrates. Granted, this is easier given he's dead now, but that's beside the point. Irregardless, still a real word, look it up. This feels very smart to me, and I compliment myself for making such a brilliant observation that allows me to tie everything neatly back to the rather heavy basket I'm still holding. The better to eat your grandma with, my grandmother says, before climbing awkwardly out of bed. I think she probably meant to leap out of the bed and attack me, but she's kind of having trouble moving. It looks like she's had a massive meal. However, it's then I can clearly see that far from my grandmother, she is in fact the dog from before, who is apparently a wolf of some kind. I'm forced to deduce the aforementioned meal was in fact my grandmother. You're likely wondering just how he was able to disguise himself so effectively as to make himself clearly identifiable as my grandmother, while simultaneously possessing so many obvious traits that would have marked him out as a wolf. The answer is actually very simple and very satisfying, and once I relate it, everything will slot into place and tie together. But I don't really feel like it right now, irregardless. Again, look that word up. Maybe toss it into a sentence now and then. No one can stop you. Him eating her was rather unfortunate, as it meant I came all this way with a basket of goods for a woman who no longer exists. I was going to eat you, the wolf said, snarling and baring the aforementioned teeth at me. I didn't like this on account of the fear I felt. However, the wolf continued to talk, but your grandma was kind of fat, and I'm pretty full, so you can go if you want. I didn't feel like being eaten, and his offer was a generous one, and there was no sense staying when my grandmother wasn't around. Anyway, after all this, I had very gay sex with a lumberjack, which is where the rumor may have started.